The silence that followed was deafening, amplified by the sudden cessation of camera flashes. President Trump, accustomed to controlling every narrative, slowly lowered his hand, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He nodded almost imperceptibly and moved on, leaving an undeniable ripple of tension in his wake. Whispers immediately erupted among the officers and media personnel, each trying to decipher the unprecedented act. Social media, a wildfire of speculation, instantly ignited with opinions, judgments, and wild theories. Was it disrespect? A political statement? Nobody knew the truth. Not yet. For George, the pounding in his chest wasn't from fear, but from a profound sense of purpose. He knew exactly why he hadn't taken the handshake. It wasn't about political defiance, it was about something far deeper, something personal that had haunted him and his family for decades. In that moment, he felt a powerful, if terrifying, sense of hope. This silent act was his desperate gamble, his only chance to finally give a voice to the voiceless, to expose a truth buried under layers of secrecy. But first, he would have to face the immediate consequences. The instant the president moved past, a palpable wave of tension swept through the formation. George's fellow veterans avoided his gaze, but the collective unease was undeniable. Something monumental had just happened. George remained standing at attention until the ceremony was finally dismissed. As the last note of the military band faded, he was approached by a stern-faced, current-serving General Mark Peterson, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "My office, now, Colonel Hudson," General Peterson clipped, his voice low but laced with steel. Inside the stark, sterile confines of the debriefing room, General Peterson slammed the door shut, the sound echoing ominously. "Colonel," he began, his voice barely controlled, "you refused a direct gesture from the Commander-in-Chief. This is unprecedented. You owe me an explanation, and it better be a damn good one." George didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze meeting Peterson's. "With all due respect, General," George stated calmly, his voice rough with age but firm, "I had my reasons. And they are deeply personal, far beyond politics or protocol." General Peterson scoffed, pacing the small room. "Personal feelings have no place in uniform, Hudson. Not when you're representing the entire military, let alone standing before the president." George's voice, though still quiet, cracked with the immense weight of the secret he'd carried for nearly 50 years. "It's not about politics, sir," he repeated, his eyes burning with a deep, unyielding sorrow. "It's about my brother, Sergeant William Hudson. Kia in Vietnam. Friendly fire covered up. No one was ever held accountable." General Peterson stopped pacing, his face softening, a flicker of confusion replacing his anger. "Your brother? What are you talking about?" "Sir," George continued, his voice strained, "my family never got answers. I joined the army, built a career, hoping one day I'd have the standing to demand them. When I saw the president, I thought, maybe this was my only chance to make someone at the very top finally notice. To finally listen." General Peterson leaned back against his desk, quiet for a long moment, the weight of George's words hanging heavy in the air. "You realize this is going to reach the highest levels, Colonel," he said, his tone now subdued. "Be ready for whatever comes next." George gave a crisp, unwavering nod. "I've been ready for decades, sir." Outside the room, the story was already spinning wildly, but the true reason for his defiance hadn't even begun to surface. By morning, George Hudson was all over the news. Veteran refuses Trump's handshake, disrespect or patriotism? Unpatriotic act or personal protest? Pundits battled on air, and social media had already fractured into furious camps. George didn't have a computer, but his few trusted friends showed him the digital chaos, the memes, the accusations, the calls for his dishonorable discharge. Yet, not a single news outlet mentioned William. George sat in his small, Spartan living room, staring at a folded American flag draped carefully over a worn armchair. It was William's. His younger brother, William Hudson, had been the heart of their family, a natural-born leader even before he enlisted straight out of high school. He was the kind of young man who'd stop to help strangers change a tire, always had a joke ready, and sent home hilarious recordings to George every single weekend from basic training. William had joined the army full of youthful fire and an almost naive belief in duty and honor. And then, one humid night in the thick jungles of Vietnam, a telegram arrived. William had been killed. The official report stated enemy contact. It was devastating, but the family, heartbroken, accepted it as the tragic cost of war. Years later, long after the initial grief had subsided, George was sifting through their late father's old keepsakes. Tucked away in a dusty box of military medals and faded photographs, he found it, a letter from William, addressed to their father, but clearly never sent. The envelope was sealed, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. George carefully opened it, his hands trembling. The words inside hit him like a physical blow. William wrote of a chaotic night mission, a desperate attempt to rescue a wounded civilian under heavy fire. He hinted at confusion, a friendly misfire, and a desperate cover-up to protect the reputation of a high-ranking officer involved in the operation. The letter spoke of an internal mistake, buried to shield someone with power. "They'll never admit it, Dad," William had written, "but I wanted you to know the truth, just in case." George kept the letter, a heavy secret pressed against his heart. He showed it to their mother, who, after her initial shock, joined him in a relentless, agonizing pursuit of answers. They wrote countless letters to the Pentagon, demanded investigations, contacted every senator and congressman they could reach. But all they received in return was silence, bureaucratic stonewalling, and cold, impersonal condolences. The military, it seemed, had closed ranks. The truth, if it existed beyond William's desperate scribblings, was sealed shut. For decades, that silent promise to William, etched onto the very core of George's being, became his life's driving force. He pursued a distinguished military career not just for patriotism, but with an unwavering hope that one day, he would ascend high enough, gain enough influence, to pry open those sealed files. And now, all the world saw was a defiant old veteran breaking sacred tradition. In the quiet corner of his mind, William's final words echoed, "Just in case." George knew that now was his chance. 2 days later, the quiet of George's routine was shattered by a sharp rap on his door. Standing there was a crisply uniformed Major Evans, looking unusually grave. "Colonel Hudson," he announced briskly, "you've been summoned to Washington. By the President." George's breath caught in his throat. A summons? Not a reprimand, not a formal inquiry, but a direct summons from the Commander-in-Chief. He stood taller, his resolve solidifying. "Yes, Major." Hours later, George boarded a discreet government flight. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the otherwise quiet cabin, amplifying the thumping of his own heart. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. What would he say? What could he say? In his pocket, tucked safely inside a worn leather wallet, he carried William's letter. It was tattered, faded, almost illegible in places, but it was the one tangible piece of truth he had left. This wasn't just about a handshake anymore. This was about a promise he'd made almost 5 decades ago, whispered over a cold, granite headstone, "I'll find the truth, William. No matter what it takes." The decades of frustration, the unanswered letters, the dismissive silence from official channels, it all coalesced into this single, pivotal moment. He rehearsed his words, the facts, the raw emotion. He imagined every possible outcome, from a swift dismissal to an angry confrontation. But underneath the apprehension, a fragile seed of hope began to bloom. This was the opening he had yearned for, the chance to finally pierce the veil of silence. The car ride from the airport to the White House was a blur of DC landmarks, but George barely noticed them. His mind was focused, sharp, recalling every detail of William's letter, every word he'd spoken to his grieving mother, every brick wall he'd hit in his long, solitary pursuit of justice. As the vehicle pulled up to the West Wing, a quiet wave of history washed over him. This place, the epicenter of power, was where decisions were made, where secrets could be buried, and perhaps, where they could finally be unearthed. He was led into a spacious, well-appointed office. President Trump stood behind the resolute desk, his hands folded in a posture of attentive expectation. Two quiet aides stood near the wall, almost invisible. The atmosphere was formal, yet surprisingly private. "Colonel Hudson," President Trump began, his voice calm, devoid of the usual bluster. "You refused my handshake. Care to tell me why?" George took a deep, steadying breath. "Yes, Mr. President," he replied, his voice clear and resonant. "It's about my brother, Sergeant William Hudson. Killed in action in Vietnam. The details, sir, they never added up." George carefully extracted the fragile, folded letter from his pocket and handed it across the desk. President Trump took the letter, his expression unreadable, and began to read. The only sound in the room was the rustle of the old paper. His face remained largely impassive, but George noticed a subtle shift in his eyes, a tightening, a deepening of focus. Finally, the president looked up, the letter held loosely in his hand. "This was hidden." "Yes, sir," George confirmed, his voice regaining its strength. "For decades. My family tried to get answers. Nothing ever came. Just silence." President Trump's gaze bore into George's. "And you thought refusing my handshake would make me look bad?" "No, sir," George replied, meeting his gaze squarely. "I hoped it would make someone listen. Someone in your position. Someone who could finally cut through the red tape and demand the truth." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, President Trump nodded slowly, a profound stillness settling over him. "You were right, Colonel," he said, his voice softer than George had expected. He turned to his aides, his tone now decisive. "I want this investigated. Quietly, but thoroughly. Every detail. If someone covered this up, I want to know who, and I want to know why." George stood there, stunned. He hadn't expected that. He'd prepared for anger, for dismissal, but not this. "I'm sorry about your brother, Colonel," President Trump continued, his voice genuinely empathetic. "And I respect what you did." George, moved but still composed, gave a firm nod. For the first time in nearly 50 years, he felt a powerful surge of hope. The truth, buried for so long, finally had a chance to breathe. Within days, an internal military task force was quietly assembled, its directive clear: review the long-dormant file of Sergeant William Hudson's death. The investigation moved with a speed George had only dreamed of for decades. Teams of seasoned military investigators, unhampered by old loyalties or bureaucratic inertia, meticulously sifted through dusty archives and digital records, delving into classified documents that had remained untouched for years. They interviewed retired officers, sifted through old radio logs, and cross-referenced fragmented reports. Buried deep within a forgotten section of a classified archive, tucked away in a microfiche file labeled Incident 73D, Engagement Misanalysis, they found it. A series of internal communications, signed by a then-Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thorne, now a retired but highly respected senior officer, detailed the initial battlefield assessment. Thorne's original report candidly described Williams' unit being caught in a chaotic crossfire while attempting to secure a civilian evacuation route. Crucially, it noted a misfire from an Allied position that fatally wounded William. The subsequent communications, chilling in their calculated precision, showed Thorne's direct request for the report to be rewritten as Kia under confirmed enemy fire, to avoid unnecessary scrutiny, and protect the integrity of the tactical command chain. There it was, in black and white, a decorated officer had deliberately altered the truth to shield his own career and reputation. George sat in disbelief in a sterile Pentagon conference room as a grim-faced official from the task force laid out the findings. The images on the screen, satellite maps, and recreated diagrams showed Williams' final moments with agonizing clarity. "Colonel Hudson," the official began, his voice flat, your brother, Sergeant William Hudson, was attempting to help a wounded civilian woman and her child when he was struck by a misfire from his own unit. The cover-up, meticulously documented, was signed off on by Lieutenant Colonel Thorne days later. It appears he feared a formal inquiry would derail his career and bring negative attention to his command. Tears welled in George's eyes, hot and unexpected. He clenched his jaw, the weight of the injustice almost unbearable. "So," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "he died a hero, trying to save innocent lives, and they buried the truth to protect a man's career?" The official nodded, his expression somber. "Yes, Colonel. But not anymore. Justice is coming." The full impact of the revelation hit George hard. The pain of William's loss was still there, but now, finally, it was accompanied by a profound sense of vindication. The truth, so long a phantom, had materialized, sharp and undeniable. He thought of his mother, gone now, who had spent years tirelessly pursuing those answers, her heart breaking a little more with each unanswered letter. This was for her, too. In a surprise press briefing held just days later, President Trump took the podium, his demeanor unusually solemn. "I want to address an incident that has recently made headlines," he began, his voice resonating through the room, "involving a courageous American veteran, Colonel George Hudson, who gave me a very important reason to look deeper into a long-held secret." He held up a large, framed photograph of a young, smiling William Hudson in his Army uniform. "This soldier," President Trump continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, "Sergeant William Hudson, was failed by a system meant to honor him. His valorous death in Vietnam was deliberately covered up. And today, we set that record straight." Reporters gasped. Cameras flashed in a blinding frenzy. The news spread like wildfire. "Colonel Hudson reminded us all what honor truly means," President Trump concluded, his voice firm, "not just in battle, but in speaking truth, even when it costs you everything." In that electrifying moment, the nation finally saw the full, tragic, and ultimately triumphant story. George returned to his quiet home, a different man. The weight of his decades-long quest had lifted, replaced by a sense of profound, if bittersweet, resolution. A few days later, General Peterson arrived at his door, no longer stern, but with a small, respectful smile. "Colonel Hudson," he said, extending his hand, "the President has personally approved your promotion to Brigadier General. Effective immediately." But George, though touched, shook his head gently. "Thank you, General," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I didn't do this for rank. My duty was to my brother, and to the truth." General Peterson nodded slowly, his expression understanding. "I know, George. We all do now." That evening, at a quiet, unpublicized assembly held at the local Veterans Hall, something unexpected happened. A new, crisply folded American flag was presented to George, bearing William's name, rank, and the corrected date of his true heroic sacrifice. Accompanying it was an official letter of apology from the Department of Defense, recognizing William's true cause of death and his selfless actions. As the last rays of the setting sun streamed through the hall's windows, casting a warm glow on the proceedings, George clutched the flag tightly, his eyes misty. "You were right, William," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Truth matters. Always." Back home, hundreds of miles away, George's elderly sister, the last surviving member of their immediate family, wept as she watched the news report of the public apology. "They finally said his name right," she sobbed, holding a faded photograph of William. George embraced her tightly, a shared grief and relief washing over them. She carefully placed William's photo on the mantelpiece, next to their parents'. "He was never forgotten," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But now, he's remembered the way he should be." George didn't need to say anything. Her tears, a lifetime of unspoken sorrow finally released, said it all. A week later, a package arrived for George. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was William's posthumously awarded Silver Star, quietly approved decades ago but never officially delivered. With it, a handwritten note from President Trump himself. Colonel Hudson, it read in elegant script, some things can't be undone, and the pain of loss can never truly fade. But truth, Colonel, truth can still be honored. Your courage has ensured that. George held the medal close, speechless, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth spreading through his chest. It was a tangible symbol of not just William's sacrifice, but the enduring power of persistence and integrity. Driven by a renewed sense of purpose, George decided to share his deeper message. He drafted an open letter, not to any specific person, but to the nation. I didn't refuse a handshake to disrespect a man, he wrote, his words carefully chosen, I did it to honor my brother, Sergeant William Hudson. Truth doesn't wear a uniform, it lives in the heart. Speak up, even when it costs something. The letter spread like wildfire across social media, shared by millions. Veterans, families, and complete strangers sent him messages of solidarity and gratitude. Thank you, countless notes read. We needed this. You gave us courage. George didn't feel like a hero, he felt like a brother who had finally kept a sacred promise. He graciously accepted a new deployment order, not overseas, but to join a special task force within the Pentagon, tasked with reviewing mishandled military reports from past conflicts. A small smile touched his lips as he read the brief. We're cleaning house, William, he murmured to himself. His diligent work uncovered 6 more cases strikingly similar to William's, instances where bravery was obscured by official expediency. Each time, George personally wrote to the affected families, delivering the long-delayed truth. Quietly, powerfully, the truth spread, bringing solace to those who had endured decades of unanswered questions. A new section was unveiled on the National Memorial, simply titled Truth Restored. William's name was there, alongside others who had been unjustly forgotten, their stories now rightly told. At a grand veterans fundraiser a few months later, filled with dignitaries and flashing lights, President Trump again approached George. This time, without hesitation, George extended his hand. President Trump grasped it firmly, a shared understanding passing between them. No words were needed. The gesture, imbued with the weight of all that had transpired, meant everything. It was a silent acknowledgement of a battle fought and a truth reclaimed. Inspired by the profound impact of his actions, George formally established the Silent Salute Foundation. Its mission was clear, to advocate tirelessly for truth and accountability in military deaths and misconduct, ensuring no more families would suffer the decades of silence he and his had endured. What began as a single, defiant moment transformed into a powerful national movement, giving voice to countless untold stories and championing the integrity of military service. Years passed. George, now a revered figure in the veteran community, continued his work with the foundation, a quiet force for justice. At a casual new recruit orientation at a local Army base, George was a guest speaker. Afterwards, a young Army recruit, barely out of high school, approached him shyly. Colonel Hudson, the recruit whispered, his voice laced with awe, your story, it gave me courage, sir. To ask what really happened to my uncle in Afghanistan. His death never made sense to my family. George turned, his eyes warm and encouraging. Don't stop asking, he advised, his voice gentle but firm. Because silence helps no one. Ever. Even his staunchest early critics, who had initially branded his act as political grandstanding, had to admit that this wasn't about politics. This was about integrity. This was about justice. And slowly, the noise of the initial controversy began to quiet, replaced by a wave of respect and reflection across the nation. One quiet morning, as the sun began to paint the sky with hues of dawn, George Hudson drove to the National Memorial. He walked to the Truth Restored section, the granite cool beneath his fingertips. He found William's name, etched there for eternity, alongside the others. Gently, almost reverently, George placed William's silver star beside his brother's stone. The medal, a belated symbol of heroism, glinted in the early light. He stood silently, then snapped to attention, rendering a crisp, precise salute. And for the very first time, after decades of carrying the burden of truth, George felt a profound, absolute peace. "They finally know, William," he whispered into the morning breeze, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. This story didn't end with noise. It ended with truth, with honor, and with the quiet, powerful sound of a brother's promise, finally, beautifully fulfilled. Comment, respect, and share this story to honor all those who fight for truth.